Hello, everyone. I want to ask you how many people are concerned about eating GMOs. Raise your hand. Okay, nearly everyone. And I want to ask you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you are at avoiding GMOs. That includes going out to eat, includes eating at other people's houses. How vigilant are you? Give yourself a number. Okay, how many people are the low vigilance? 0 to 20, raise your hand. 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. All right? Now rate yourself how active you've been talking about GMOs to others. Low active, 0 to 20, raise your hand. 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. All right, now some of you are at the bottom and some of you are at the top. For those of you who have been vigilant at avoiding GMOs, how many of you noticed an improvement in your health when you switched to a non-GMO diet? Many of you, excellent. Almost everyone who was in the higher realms of vigilance. So I'd like to hear from you what kind of problems went away or got better. Anyone? Yes, in the back. Arthritis. How many people noticed an improvement in arthritis? 3 of you, 4 of you. And inflammation of any type. Lots of hands. Pain, raise your hand. Okay, so a lot of you clumped around pain, inflammation, and of course arthritis. Another symptom that got better or disappeared. Yes? Digestive issues. Okay, how many people noticed an improvement in digestive health? That's the biggest, it's always the biggest number of hands. I've asked this question at over 150 lectures. Digestive health always is the grand winner. And that would include what? Inflammatory bowel, irritable bowel, acid reflux, bloating. What am I missing? That covers it, huh? All right. Another symptom. Yes? Thinking clearly. Thinking clearly. What did you say? No, sorry. Thinking clearly, yes. How many people had better memory, concentration, less brain fog? Raise your hand. Okay, how many people noticed more energy? Raise your hand. So that's always number 2, increased energy, and I usually combine it with reduced brain fog. Always number 2. Any other symptoms? Yes. High blood pressure. How many people noticed an improvement in cardiovascular health? Raise your hand. Okay, there was about several of you. All right. Any other symptoms? So what happened was when I released Genetic Roulette in 2012, I started asking this question of conferences, and I started noticing patterns. And I noticed, as we said, digestion was number 1, brain fog and improved energy was number 2, but then there were all sorts of other questions, other symptoms being resolved. And so what I did was, I created a film with Amy Hart on families that healed from serious conditions when they switched to organic food. So not just non-GMO, but organic. And in this film, there are 2 families with autistic sons who are no longer autistic. There's a clinic, a chiropractic clinic, where they treat a lot of infertile couples. They have a 100% success rate. They put them all in organic food. 92 out of 92 couples now have children. They had people recovered from cancer, skin conditions, anxiety, depression. So it is a dramatic film that is based on science. There's a lot of scientists and doctors in there explaining why. I'll show you the trailer on this later in the talk. But we also, based on the results of the information that we got, we surveyed people from the Institute for Responsible Technology website, and you can go to responsibletechnology.org and sign up to be part of that newsletter. I published this year the results of the survey, and it was peer-reviewed and published in the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine. And it showed that there were 28 different conditions that improved when people switched to a non-GMO and largely organic diet. The number one is digestive. We're going to focus on that to start, okay? And we're going to talk, I'm going to do this later. We're going to talk about the digestive problems and what could actually be causing those digestive problems. But what we're seeing is that of the 28 conditions, and again, digestive being at the top, it's not just humans that report getting better. Lab animals that are fed GMOs or exposed to Roundup, which is sprayed on most GMOs, have problems that are similar to those that improve in humans when they switch to organic. Same thing with livestock and pets. And the rates of disease, of these types of diseases, are going up in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup. Now, when you look at the pets, there was 3,256 people who responded to our survey about themselves or their patients or a family member. But 80 people responded in terms of their pets. And you could see that the number one reported improvement with the pets is also digestive. They also had similar results in food allergies, skin conditions, energy, weight problems, and joint pain. If you look at the animal feeding studies, now again, we're just going to focus on digestion to start. There were changes in animal feeding studies in the gastrointestinal system and gut bacteria, severe stomach inflammation, stomach lesions, excessive growth or damage of the intestinal walls, and a reduced ability to digest protein and minerals. In livestock, there was reported by farmers and veterinarians diarrhea, gut bacteria imbalance, and intestinal damage. In the humans, they reported irritable bowel, Crohn's disease, acid reflux, ulcers, gut pain, and bloating. All of these associated with eating GMOs or non-organic food and getting better. Now, when we talk about the digestive problems getting better, it was significant. This is the breakdown. People would say digestive orders, but then they'd have to measure how much of their digestive health or any of those conditions improved. And you could see, if you look at this, the biggest category was significant improvement, followed by nearly gone, followed by complete recovery. 80% of the respondents were in those three categories, just by switching to a organic diet or non-GMO and largely organic diet. If you look at the statistics in the United States, you can see that the amount of glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. Roundup is sprayed on most GMOs because most GMOs are Roundup ready, genetically engineered specifically to be sprayed with Roundup. You could see that as the glyphosate spray on soy and corn that's genetically engineered went up, so did the hospital discharge diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease. Here we have deaths due to intestinal infection. And here is peritonitis, which is inflammation inside the stomach lining. All of these show correlations. It doesn't mean that one causes the other if you just look at the chart. But if you understand that there is a plausible reason why glyphosate or GMOs might create digestive problems, then these correlations are more meaningful. So we're going to look and see what is it about a GMO and Roundup that might cause this digestive disorder. The main GMOs are all either sprayed with Roundup, they're all sprayed with Roundup, and a couple of them also produce their own toxin called Bt toxin, which kills insects. Soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa. They're all Roundup ready, and then the cotton and corn, as well as some soy in South America, are also Bt producing. They actually are registered as pesticides. They kill insects. So we'll be looking at three reasons why GMOs might be causing these problems. One is the Roundup, the other is the Bt toxin, and the third is the very process of genetic engineering itself. So we'll call that the first possible cause, just the generic process. Typically, if you wanted to create a genetically engineered corn plant that produced its own Bt toxin, you'd get the Bt, or the Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria. You'd isolate a particular gene, make millions of copies, and blast those copies of the gene into a plate of cells, or infect it with bacteria, then clone those cells into a plant. That process of insertion plus cloning creates massive collateral damage. 2 to 4% of the DNA is different. You can have deletions, replications, and up to 5% of the naturally functioning genes can change their levels of expression as a result of this process. Now, if you look at the stomach lining on this slide, on the right is the stomach of rats that were fed genetically modified potatoes, and the left are natural potatoes. Now, these potatoes were prepared for the study by Dr. Arpad Pusztai. He was paid $3 million to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs, paid by the UK government. His protocol was supposed to be used by Europe in their approval process. He fed one group of rats potatoes that were engineered to produce an insecticide, not the Bt. He fed another group of rats natural potatoes of the same variety, but not GMO. A third group of rats were fed natural potatoes, but the diet was spiked with the same insecticide that the GMOs produced in the same amount. So you had GMO, non-GMO, non-GMO plus insecticide. Only those that ate the GMO potatoes got this potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, and partial atrophy of the liver, and a damaged immune system. What was the reason for that? It was not the insecticide being produced inside the potato. It was the process of genetic engineering that caused the damage. When I spoke to Dr. Pusztai and I said, well, yeah, tell us why GMOs are dangerous, he said, correction, GMOs are inherently dangerous. The process itself. And he said he was concerned that the GMOs on the market use the same process that produced his potatoes and could create this kind of problem. This particular slide was being observed by Michelle Peril, a pediatrician. You will see her in the trailer for Secret Ingredients. And when she looked at it, she went, uh-oh, we have a problem. This is what I'm seeing in my children. This disruption of architecture of the cells in the digestive tract. There's also disruption in the intestines, a different slide. And she realized that genetic engineering might be the reason why, in her more than 30 years of practice, around the time that GMOs were introduced and soon after, the entire frequency of disorders and diseases changed to these really complicated, often digestive-based disorders. And that the same protocols for treatment were not working like they were before. And she realized that's when GMOs and Roundup were largely introduced into the diet of her patients. And let's say she's treating a person with autism, a little boy with autism. She'll tell the entire family, switch to organic. Because she says, don't just make one type of food for the autistic boy, do it as a family. And so she'll also treat the autistic boy with all sorts of other things, but then she'll hear back from the family, the sister's ADHD is gone, the father's kidney condition's gone, the mother's lost weight. All of a sudden, the entire family starts getting healthier, and she knows it's the diet, because she didn't treat the rest of the family. The only thing they did different was switch to organic. But here we have a situation where just the very generic process of genetic engineering might be disrupting our digestive tract, and this could help explain this finding. There were also changes in Roundup-ready corn. Over 200 proteins and metabolites shifted as a result of the process of genetic engineering, including an overabundance of putrescine and cadaverine. Check out those names, putrescine and cadaverine. They're responsible for the foul odor of rotting dead bodies. They promote bad breath. They promote allergic reactions and cancer. And it's unlabeled. So if you eat a genetically modified corn product, it doesn't say extra putrescine. And it won't say extra BT, it won't say BT toxin either. It won't be tested, or it won't be labeled. So here's a second cause of problems: the BT toxin produced in the corn and cotton, and in South America in soybeans. That may be harmful. So BT toxin pokes holes in the walls of insects to kill them. And it turns out it also damages the intestines of rats. It damaged the base of the digestive cells and the microvilli. Look at the arrows to the right. You can see fragmented microvilli and also shorter microvilli. The microvilli are like the fingers coming from the walls of the intestines, that they increase the surface area by having all these little fingers. So if you spread it out, it's the size of 2 tennis courts. That's what absorbs our nutrients. When that's damaged, we absorb less. It damaged it bound to the jejunum, which is part of the small intestine, causing damage there. And it turns out in a test tube model, it pokes holes in human cells, the same type of holes that it pokes into insects to kill them. Now, holes in human cells, holes in the digestive tract. How many people have heard of leaky gut? Almost everyone. Normally, food gets broken down into eensy-beensy pieces, that's the technical term, and then it gets absorbed into the system, into the bloodstream. But if there are holes in the walls of the intestines, then larger pieces can get through, as well as pesticides and other chemicals, as well as bacteria. But let's focus on the proteins for a moment. The bigger proteins come in, and they're not in a form that the body is used to dealing with. The body treats it like an invader and attacks it. The immune system attacks it. And the immune system is a very modern immune system. It gets out the iPhone, it takes a picture of the invader, posts it on Facebook, and it says, "Attention, all members of the immune system, attack anything that looks like this." But it uses old iPhones and it's very pixelated, and so the immune system attacks anything that looks like that kind of faded photo. So it may attack the thyroid, or may attack the pancreas or the microvilli. That's what autoimmune disease is. It's the immune system attacking because it is attacking things that look like the invaders. The invaders cross the barrier because of the leaky gut. So the autoimmune disease is based on leaky gut and the old iPhones used by the immune system. And so that actually, the leaky gut is, the higher the prevalence of leaky gut, the more prevalence there is of autoimmune disease, of allergies, of inflammation, of cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism. It's a very serious condition. And BT corn pokes holes in human cells. In Canada, they found the BT toxin in 93% of the Canadian women tested, and in 80% of the pregnant women tested, and in 80% of their unborn fetuses. Now, if it gets into the bloodstream, according to a study on mice, it's toxic to red blood cells. If it gets into the fetus, there's no blood-brain barrier at that age, so the hole-poking toxin might end up in the brains of the offspring of this generation. Now, why would 93% of the pregnant women in Canada have the BT toxin in their blood if the BT toxin should be washed out very regularly? They must be having some continuous ingestion of BT toxin for it to be there in such high percentage. That's according to the study authors. But most of the BT that's ingested in North America pretty much all of it, is from corn. The cottonseed oil that we eat doesn't have the Bt toxin in it, but most of the corn consumed in Canada and the United States is the highly refined corn, corn syrup, corn oil. And that doesn't have the Bt toxin in it either. It wasn't like it was done in Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day. So the authors surmised that the exposure was being developed or built up by eating the milk and meat of animals, because the animals are fed Bt corn and cotton meal. So I would like to propose a different plausible explanation. The only human feeding study ever conducted on the GMOs currently in the market showed that the genes from soybeans that were genetically engineered to resist spray from Roundup, part of them transferred into the DNA of our gut bacteria. Now, they didn't follow this up to see if the same thing happened with corn. But if it did, and if the Bt genes transferred to gut bacteria, and if they continued to function, that might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories. So that our very gut bacteria, which is useful for so many things, might be a cause of producing this Bt toxin, which is known to elicit immune system responses and to poke holes in human cells. So the reason why the 93% of the pregnant women tested had Bt toxin in their blood might have been because they were producing it themselves inside their own digestive tract. The third possible problem is that there are more herbicide residues. Before we get there, I'd like to ask, can you see already some reasons why the process of genetic engineering and Bt toxin might explain the increase in digestive disorders? Obviously, holes in the walls of the intestines, allergic responses from the Bt, that could increase histamine. Histamine is related to digestive health as well. The extra growth in the stomach wall, the intestinal walls, etc. Roundup may be worse. Roundup, since it has been introduced, the weeds have developed a resistance, and so farmers are using more and more Roundup. The amount of herbicides used in the United States in the first 16 years of GMOs, because of the herbicide-tolerant crops, increased by over 500 million pounds. Now, Roundup, it was originally patented to clean boilers and pipes. Not Roundup, but glyphosate, the so-called active ingredient. And that's because it is a chelator. It grabs onto the minerals. You know that mineral buildup that happens inside boilers and pipes and your tea kettle and whatnot? Well, glyphosate grabs those and pulls and binds with them. So it's a descaler. But it also uses that same action, that same mode of action to kill plants. And it's also and so when it's sprayed, when the Roundup is sprayed on the plants become mineral deficient. And the number one consumer of the mineral deficient plants are the livestock in the United States, and they are mineral deficient. Then we eat the mineral deficient meat, the mineral deficient plants, and we have excess residues of Roundup on the food, which then binds with minerals and makes them unavailable. Without certain minerals, certain biochemical pathways will not function. Glyphosate is also an antibiotic. It kills gut bacteria. And studies show that it more effectively kills lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, the stuff that we want, the good bacteria, the stuff that we pay for, the stuff that reduces inflammation. It has difficulty killing the salmonella, the botulism, the negative E. coli, the stuff that we don't want to overgrow. But if it overgrows, that dysbiosis is linked to a long list of diseases. It blocks a pathway used by the gut bacteria that produces L-tryptophan, and other aromatic amino acids, which are the building blocks for dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin, important neurotransmitters. The feel-good chemicals, the chemicals that helps us go to sleep. And this will explain some of the other disorders of the 28 that are getting better. It also damages the microvilli and suppresses digestive enzymes. All of this you could see how they could cause problems with digestion. Glyphosate, if you put it in a plate of human cells, the tight junctions between the cells will separate. This is another form of leaky gut. Holes in the cells or holes between the cells. Leaky gut, if it's increasing in the United States, that could explain many of those 28 different diseases. This is inside of a gut of cows, and it shows that glyphosate kills a certain bacteria that, when it's in prevalence, it keeps in check Clostridium botulinum. And when it's not there, the Clostridium botulinum increase. The Clostridium botulinum produces botulism toxin. And there is an epidemic of chronic botulism among the cow herds in Northern Europe, and this researcher, Dr. Kruger, and others believe that it's the Roundup-ready crops being fed to the animals that is causing the chronic botulism. In 2015, the World Health Organization declared glyphosate a probable human carcinogen. They said it is cancerous to animals. It also causes mutations which can lead to cancer, and where it is sprayed, there are higher rates of cancer. I'm from California now, and in California, glyphosate is listed as a carcinogen. Roundup causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, the study that was done fed rats a tiny amount of glyphosate in the drinking water. And they found that there was a definite cause of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which affects 25% of the US population and can lead to more serious diseases, including liver cancer. The EPA, which is largely controlled by the companies it's supposed to regulate, including Monsanto, ignores the low-dose effects and allows huge amounts of glyphosate in our food supply in spite of the evidence. So the amount of glyphosate that they say is acceptable in our water supply is 437,000 times more per body weight than the rats ate that got non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Here's rat livers on the right of rats that were fed genetically modified soy that was sprayed with Roundup. These are testicles that changed from pink to blue in an unpublished study in Moscow. The testicles also changed in mice that were fed GM soy in another study. They had damage to the young sperm cells. And there were changes in the uterus and ovaries of the rats fed GMO soy. Now I was speaking at the European Parliament with a Russian Academy of Sciences scientist, and she gave me these slides. So these are Russian-speaking rats. And they volunteered to be fed GM soy starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant and continued eating the soy through pregnancy and lactation. And more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks compared to a 10% death rate when the other rats were fed non-GMO soy. The rats were also smaller and could not reproduce. Hamsters fed GM soy for 2 years. Most were sterile. They grew slower, and their death rate was 4 or 5 times higher. In research conducted in France, they fed rats genetically modified Roundup-ready corn that had been sprayed with Roundup, and the rats developed multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. They also fed a group of rats genetically modified corn that had not been sprayed with Roundup, same type of corn, same results, multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So it's obviously the corn, right, that causes the problem and not the Roundup. However, a third group of rats were fed the Roundup without the corn, and they also had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So it was both the corn and the Roundup independently and together that caused these problems. A study on pigs, who weirdly have a physiology similar to humans. I don't understand that. They've had severe inflammation in their stomachs when they ate GMO feed compared to non-GMO feed. And the color and even the smell of the carcasses of the meat of the cattle are very different when they're fed GMO versus non-GMO. They have signs of accelerated aging. So we're going to go back to the 28 different conditions. I'm going to read to you some of them, the more common ones. And having seen some of the modes of action of the process of genetic engineering and Bt toxin and Roundup, you might be able to predict, especially if you have a medical background, why the GMOs, Roundup, and Bt toxin might actually predict or cause these problems. Digestive disorders, low energy, obesity, brain fog, food allergies, anxiety and depression, memory and concentration, joint pain, seasonal allergies, gluten sensitivity, insomnia, other skin conditions besides eczema, hormonal problems, musculoskeletal pain, autoimmune disease, eczema, high blood pressure, asthma, menstrual problems, diabetes, other mental disorders besides anxiety and depression, underweight, cancer, kidney disease, infertility, autism, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. And it's amazing. I've brought doctors up on stage with me and said, okay, knowing the modes of action just of Roundup, just of glyphosate, could you predict that any of these would happen? And every single one could be explained by the modes of action just of Roundup. And then if you add the Bt toxin in the process of genetic engineering, I asked Dr. Seralini, who handled those, he's the one that created that study with the 3 rats. I said, if you looked just at the research on GMOs and Roundup, what problems would you predict, even if you didn't know? He said, digestive first, and then hormonal and organ damage there, including the heart. So I'm going to go through some other studies that just show correlation between glyphosate or GMOs crops and specific diseases. I'm just going to go through these quickly, and I'm just going to name the disease, and you get to see the relationship. Congenital birth defects, acute kidney failure and death, hepatitis C, ADHD, anxiety, schizophrenia, autism. This is one way of evaluating autism, hospital discharge. Here's another one, a number of children 6 to 21 years old. And here's a third one, prevalence of 6-year-olds. In this one, they actually combine the amount of glyphosate over that year and the previous 3 years. So it was a kind of a cumulative total of glyphosate exposure over 4 years. Now, the R value is how correlated it is. If it's 100% correlation, it's a 1. This was a 0.9972. Nearly identical. Bile duct and liver cancer, kidney and pelvic cancer, urinary and bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths due to leukemia. This is diabetes. We just heard a conference on, or a panel on diabetes. This is hemorrhage. Senile dementia. Alzheimer's. Parkinson's. These are deaths from Alzheimer's, deaths from Parkinson's. Deaths due to obesity. Deaths due to hypertension. Anemia. Dementia. Insomnia. Overall sleep disorders. Vitamin D deficiency. Celiac disease. Newborn metabolic disorders. Suicide by overdose. Hospitalizations from acute kidney injury. We mentioned lipoprotein metabolism. I'd like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100, how vigilant you plan to be at avoiding GMOs going forward. How many people plan to be low vigilance, 0 to 20? Raise your hand. For those that can't see in the live stream, no one has raised their hand. 20 to 40? No one has raised their hand. Go on, be bold. 40 to 60? We got a slow motion hand going up. Like this, I think I will, I think I will, I think I will. But then I have to stay at my friend's house and I'm not eating. I'm a student, I have to eat. All right, 60 to 80? Got a few hands, 80 to 100. Most everyone is in the 80 to 100 category. And that took 30 minutes, 35 minutes. So this is an interesting finding. How do you get people to stop eating GMOs? You tell them the truth. And that turns out to be a very powerful strategy for eliminating GMOs. But first, I'm going to help you in your commitment now that you want to help avoid GMOs. I want to ask you, first of all, how active you want to be at educating others. Remember we asked that earlier before? How many people plan to be low active, educating others? 0 to 20, raise your hand. No one yet. 20 to 40. No one yet. 40 to 60. 1. 60 to 80. A few. 80 to 100. Most everyone. So the same information that changes your diet allows that information to go viral. This, as an activist, as a change agent, this is really important information. So sharing it with others turns out to be extremely important. Additional crops to avoid, unless they're organic: Hawaiian or Chinese papaya, some zucchini, and some yellow squash, not just crooknut, but yellow squash. Also, pre-sliced apples and pre-sliced potatoes, engineered not to brown when they're sliced. Now these come from a different technology called double-stranded RNA. Now, the double-stranded RNA that's produced by the inserted gene, it's up to 22 nucleotides long, and it matches up with the same corresponding code in the DNA of the apple or potato. They link together and it gets silenced. The gene gets silenced. It's a little more technical, but that's what happens. The problem is that that same code could link up with our DNA and silence genes. They tested this concept with mice and found, yes, indeed, they could eat food-based RNA and it changed their gene expression in a cell in the liver. And they tested it with honeybees. And they fed the honeybees a single meal of double-stranded RNA. It was double-stranded RNA from something that had never been part of the honeybee diet and had never been part of the honeybee DNA, so they figured it would be a control, showing no impact. Over the next few weeks after the one single meal, over 1,400 genes changed levels of expression. 10% of the number of genes in the honeybee from a single meal. I talked to a government scientist who said that he tried to blow the whistle up, basically, saying that the government has no capacity to evaluate the impact of double-stranded RNA. He was forced out of his position, ostracized, he left. So even government scientists at the USDA and EPA warning about double-stranded RNA were ignored, and the potato and apple are on the market. Please avoid them. It could reprogram our DNA. Could be worse than all of the types of GMOs we were already on the market. Glyphosate, Roundup, is also used on non-GMO crops just before harvest as a ripening agent. So it's sprayed on wheat, barley, rye, oats, basically all the cereals, lentils, potatoes, sweet potatoes, citrus orchards, sunflower fields, sugarcane. The EPA, to accommodate this practice, increased the allowable levels of glyphosate residues on over 160 crops. So we'd like to urge you, when you're avoiding GMOs, to just go organic. Then you avoid the Roundup and other toxic chemicals that are used on some non-GMO crops. If you can't get organic, only then make sure it's non-GMO. And at non-GMOshoppingguide.com, we list those that are verified by the Non-GMO Project, which is the most significant of the non-GMO labels. Now, I mentioned earlier about the potato experiment. Remember the stomach lining of those rats? That was Dr. Arpad Pusztai, hired to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. When he discovered that the process of genetic engineering was so dangerous, he went public with his concerns on a TV interview, supported by his prestigious institute, and then 2 phone calls were the next day placed by the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the secretary to the director. The next day, Dr. Pusztai was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. His 20-member research team was disbanded. The data was pulled away. His house was burglarized, and the data that he had in his house was stolen. And 7 months and 1 heart attack later, the UK Parliament invited him to speak. They lifted his gag order. He got his data back. It's now published. It shows these problems. But what it did also, and I opened my book, Seeds of Deception, with this, is it shows that on the day that the director of the institute that had fired him told 30 Press that the restrictions on Dr. Pusztai's speaking to the press had been lifted, they all left the room before he finished the sentence and rushed over to Dr. Pusztai's house to finally be able to hear what he had to say, because he had been gagged. 30 people filed into his living room and listened to what he had to say. Over the next month, over 700 articles on GMOs were published in the newspapers and magazines of the UK. Almost nothing in the United States. Within 10 weeks, Unilever said no more GMOs in our European brands. The next day, same with Nestle's. The next week, virtually everyone else. Same companies were selling GMOs to unsuspecting Americans. The tipping point of consumer rejection had occurred in Europe, but not the United States. So the Institute for Responsible Technology, which I founded in 2003, has been focusing on educating consumers about the health dangers, and I'm happy to say the tipping point is underway now in the United States. We're actually getting rid of GMOs more and more in these companies. What's important now is to actually get people to switch not only to non-GMO, but also to organic. So I'm going to ask the AV people in the back to play the trailer for the movie Secret Ingredients, which focuses on organic, which includes non-GMO and non-Roundup. And then we'll come back to the slides and to your questions. You guys ready for that? Okay. I have no sound.
So at the time that I was doing triathlons and living a healthy lifestyle, I met my husband. He also was very dedicated to healthy living, and we got married and started our family. So we had children and a brand new house, and we both had careers that we loved, and we were both active and physical, and that all came to a screeching halt in August of 2007.
I mean, after all, it's a poison.
The biggest fraud in the history of science.
And we are the guinea pigs.
We had 21 chronic diseases in one family.
I have had 3 miscarriages.
Things like cancer don't just happen. They happen for a reason.
We are losing control of our food supply. I've seen a rapid decline in children's health in the past 10 to 15 years.
We had to rent the nebulizer so often from the pediatrician that she suggested we buy our own.
My daughter was about 8 years old, and she was puffy, and she was starting to develop breasts.
His body was covered in rashes, head to toe, behind the knees, was so inflamed, he was bleeding.
Kids who can't control themselves, kids who can't transition, kids who can't focus, kids who can't sleep.
A well-respected neurologist said that he would never speak and that he would never have peer relationships or social experiences, potentially not live on his own, never get married.
Why is a chemical company in charge of the food?
So many diseases and disorders have skyrocketed since the introduction of GMOs and Roundup in the food supply in the mid-1990s. Asthma, allergies, autism, ADHD, anxiety, autoimmune disease, and that's just the A's.
The science is sound. The science is there. You just have to look at it.
I've removed genetically modified food and had kids eat all organic food. No pesticides, no GMOs. And the changes I've seen are remarkable.
So we went from, your son has autism, your daughter has asthma, to no, they don't.
It's been 8 years since my diagnosis. I compete in triathlons, and I feel great. Her belly is completely flattened out, and she's stopped that accelerated development. She is where I feel like she belongs as an 11-year-old little girl.
Stephen now is an articulate, lovely, straight-A student with many friends, active, plays sports. He participates in a mainstream classroom without any supports, no speech therapy, no articulation disorder, no physical therapy, no occupational therapy. He does all the things other children do with great ease and elegance and grace, and he is perfect.
I am 22 weeks pregnant, and I feel fantastic.
This shift can only come by a global desire to change our food supply.
The removal of genetically modified foods, glyphosate, and pesticides was the fundamental, the foundation for why we all recovered.
Our families have been told a lie.
You want to see it? Excellent. So go to secretingredientsmovie.com and sign up for being notified. If you are already a subscriber to responsibletechnology.org, we will certainly notify you the moment it is ready to distribute. And it is finished now. So it's now preparing for distribution. So I've got more to say, but I want to hear from you. I'd like to hear your questions first. I'll repeat the question so that the people on the live stream can hear. So if you have a law, you're going to hand out a microphone? All right. Raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello, testing. So it would be safe to say that not to buy some fruit or vegetable or something that was modified, like say there's seedless grapes and there's seed grapes. So the seedless one's been tampered with, seedless. So you should buy seed, like watermelon that has seeds in it.
So
would be healthier for you?
The list that I showed you are the only GMOs. Soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, zucchini, yellow squash, papaya from Hawaii or China, apples and potatoes. There's also salmon, sold only in Canada so far. I wouldn't eat that either. But those are the only GMOs. So you can create seedless watermelons through hybridization, which is very different. That's crossing a watermelon that has one characteristic with another, and then you create offspring through sexual reproduction. You're not taking a gene from one species and blasting it with a gene gun into a plate of cells and cloning it into a plant, causing massive collateral damage. It's a different process with different risks. In fact, the FDA's own scientists describe the process of genetic engineering as different with unique risks and urge their superiors to require testing. They said the process could create allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and were ignored. The person in charge of policy at the FDA was Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president, then back to the FDA as the U.S. food czar under Obama. So basically, the fox owns the hen house.
As long as it's organic, it's fine.
Organic is fine. Now, the Environmental Working Group has a clean 15 and a dirty dozen, but they ignore glyphosate and they ignore GMOs. So I don't pay attention to that as my guide, because they have corn and papaya on the clean 15. Papaya from Hawaii and China is GMO. Corn can be genetically engineered. Now, 94% of the corn in the United States is genetically engineered. The corn on the cob is a lower percentage. In fact, corn pollinates per kernel. So there could be one or two kernels from another field. So it's like, but mostly like a zucchini. Is it GMO or is it not? It's kind of Clint Eastwood, feeling lucky. You know, what do I do? What do I do? So for purchasing your own, zucchini, yellow squash, corn on the cob, organic, absolutely. Papaya, if it's not from Hawaii or China, it won't be GMO. But the seedless watermelon, seedless grapes, that's hybridization. Next question. Someone has a question over here? Yeah. You have to ask on the microphone.
Thank you so much for coming and presenting. It's so informative to have you here. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask you, I have seen things that say, like it say beans or seeds, it say organic, but then some say non-GMO. So does it have to have the word non-GMO to be non-GMO?
Excellent question. Organic does not allow the intentional use of GMOs or Roundup. The Non-GMO project does not focus on Roundup, just GMOs. Organic never requires testing, or doesn't generally require testing of stuff for it to be organic. It's a document review. And it could be contaminated with GMOs. If it is, it's usually a low level. Sometimes it's high level. But they don't require testing to verify no contamination. The Non-GMO project does. So if you see something that says organic and Non-GMO project verified, that's the gold standard. It's organic, so it doesn't allow the use of glyphosate or atrazine or other nasties like that. Doesn't allow the intentional use of GMOs. Contamination can occur. But even if it says non-GMO project verified and organic, it still might have some contamination, because low levels of contamination are the nature of nature. The non-GMO project has a 0.9% action threshold. So They don't have a zero tolerance because that would make it impractical, because the supply, even the seed supply, is somewhat contaminated with corn, which readily cross-pollinates, and canola. Next question. In the corner over there.
We grew up on Long Island eating local corn all summer long. So obviously now that we've changed over and we're not eating GMO, we probably still have all glyphosate in our system. Like, how long does that take to get out of your system? Is there anything to do to try to get it out more quickly?
That's a good question. I just started a series called Healing from GMOs, which helps people do other things besides avoid GMOs. So I interview doctors who have specific products and protocols to help clean the system out. And there was one product, I interviewed the formulator of the product. It's called Biomedic by Purium. And it reduces the amount of glyphosate in the urine by 74% in its preclinical trial, even without the people changing their diet. And according to David Sandoval, who I interviewed twice, the one aspect of the Biomedic lifts the toxins out of the tissue, another grabs it and takes it out of the body, another rebuilds the microvilli. So it was very interesting. It was formulated specifically to counter the effects of GMOs and Roundup. And if you'd like to, I should mention this because the Institute for Responsible Technology receives some portion of your purchase if you happen to go to the Purium website and enter the code HFGMOS, which stands for Healing from GMOs. HFGMOS. So that was an example of one product that did that. Then there was another one that was helping to combine the tight junctions, and then there was one that was trying to break down the Bt toxin inside the stomach before it got into the intestines. So I don't even know if the healingfromgmos.com website has a way of signing up for it. If you're signing up for responsibletechnology.org, we'll let you know when those play again. We're going to be interviewing more and more people. I just started this thing, so this is like the first time I'm speaking in public about this. And so I didn't even know, do I send them to the website? Have I even checked? But in general, the amount of glyphosate in the body should come out if you're not exposed to it, because there is some kind of bioaccumulation, as discovered by Anthony Samsel, a scientist who was able to procure the secret documents held by the EPA. They were submitted by Monsanto that got their glyphosate approved. And he looked at the radio-labeled assays and found that there was glyphosate sticks around in the organs, he said, for 14 days. But that would mean that it would come out after that. I'm not sure. I haven't verified those numbers or seen what happens if someone stops eating it altogether. But even if you stop eating it because you're organic, some organic food is contaminated with it, for sure. It's in the air, especially in the Midwest, where Roundup-ready crops are planted readily. It's in the rain in the Midwest. It's in the drinking supply. It could be in the meat as well. It's not organic. They checked the urine of European city dwellers, and they found glyphosate in most of those, most of the urine. It's sprayed on lawns. It's sprayed in parks. It's sprayed on school grounds. They've tested the urine of pets, much higher levels. We tested the urine of pet food, higher than average in human food, but the pets also can absorb the glyphosate in their paws and roll in it, absorb through the skin. So glyphosate is ubiquitous, and you probably will not get 100% free of it in your environment. So you want to minimize it as much as possible in the food, and you want to stop using it and get your homeowners association to stop using it and get your city to stop spraying it, not just glyphosate, but all the toxic herbicides that they would normally use. And if you go to rounduprisks.com, there's a little training that I did interviewing or asking 3 people who were able to successfully stop the spraying of Roundup and other toxic chemicals in their municipalities or counties or schools or golf courses or parks. And for some, it took a single phone call and 1 email. And we have on that Roundup Risks what to say and what to send. So because it's ubiquitous and because it's environmentally exposed as well, if you have that energy to do that, or you know someone who does, send them to rounduprisks.com. For some places, it is so easy to change. All they need to know is that there's a non-toxic, cost-effective alternative. And I was just lobbying, I'm a lobbyist? No, I'm not really a lobbyist. I was just in Sacramento, California, giving presentations to members of the Senate there with someone from Irvine who helped convert the city of Irvine, and it was kicked out of schools, it was kicked out of the cities, it stopped using in parks. And she said it costs less. When you use the non-toxic alternatives, you actually end up with healthier soil, healthier lawns, you need less herbicides, and you have 30% less water use, which in California is really important. So you actually are saving money, not the first 2 years, but after about 2 years, you're actually saving money every year by building up healthier lawns and healthier gardens and healthier parks, and you don't have to keep spraying Roundup and poisoning people. It doesn't biodegrade like it said on the label for years, and then they got convicted of false advertising, first in New York and then later in France, because they kept falsely advertising it in France after they were convicted in New York. The longest reported half-life, meaning how long it takes for glyphosate to reduce in amount by 50%, was 22 years. It's usually much less. That's the longest. Depends on a bunch of conditions. But it doesn't just go away. Who has the microphone? Yeah.
So meanwhile, the Roundup, the glyphosate, goes into the water, goes into the ground, goes into the aquifers, and we drink it and shower with it?
Yep.
22 years, huh?
So the thing is, I talked to someone who was testing water and urine samples. He said, the water's not that common. I mean, it's there, depending on where you live. And so the fact that it's not that common compared to the urine doesn't really settle us individually, because it's all about our faucet and our shower. So we don't know. You can actually send your water samples in. It's about $100 to see. And there are certain filters. One of the things I'm going to do for healing from GMOs is identify the different water purifying systems that can clean out glyphosate and other toxic chemicals and interview the people that developed it, etc. Yes, so that is an issue. So the filters, right now there's a bunch of filters that, filtered water that doesn't take out glyphosate. There's a couple we've heard that do, and I'm waiting to get confirmation of that, and then I'll share it to our list. Does reverse osmosis? I will let you know. It'll be part of the general report. All right, who wants to have a question that has a microphone over here?
You mentioned just a little bit earlier on something about gut microbiome changing, the intestinal gut microbiome in the humans when you consume GMOs or glyphosate. Has there been much studies on this, or is it just in these initial stages?
So, great question. The studies were done, there were some studies done in Germany by Monika Kruger, and she did some laboratory studies on the gut microbiome types, species, with glyphosate, so that it was clear that glyphosate was killing the beneficial ones and not the nasty ones. We know that glyphosate is patented as an antibiotic, but there hasn't been any studies of human inside actual guts with glyphosate. I've talked to veterinarians. I said, what happens in the livestock after GMOs were introduced to the United States in 1996. And the 2 livestock veterinarians I spoke to said gut bacteria completely changed. One actually had to create a cultured proper gut bacteria and gave kind of a yogurt to the animals to fix it. I've heard similar things with horses, that the gut bacteria changed when they introduced GMOs into their diet. There's a lot of case study or anecdotal evidence of gut bacteria changing according to healthcare practitioners who are looking for it and see the changes when they go back. David Perlmutter, who's focused on the microbiome a lot, he wrote Grain Brain and Brain Maker. He's in the film. You may have seen him, recognized him from the trailer. He talks about the negative impacts of glyphosate in his book and in our film. So there is not enough studies for me to say this is the exact type of dysbiosis that occurs when you consume this amount of Roundup. That's the way it is with a lot of, in the article that I wrote for the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, which you can go to, I'm giving out a lot of URLs. You go to non-GMOsimprovehealth.com. non-GMOsimprovehealth.com. You can read the actual article. You can read a summary that I've written for lay people. You can watch an interview I did with Michelle Perot, and you can even sign up to receive a free copy online of my book, Genetic Roulette. So in that actual article that's peer-reviewed, I list a lot of different information about glyphosate and indicate whether or not there has been in vivo, in human or in animal studies, or whether more needs to be done. And sometimes they'll test levels of glyphosate that are too high. So we can say, oh yeah, it's an endocrine disruption, but it's middle dose or high dose. They haven't tested the low dose as an endocrine disruptor. What's interesting is that glyphosate as a whole is just, Roundup as a whole is glyphosate plus all these other adjuvants or so-called inert ingredients, which some of them are, one is 10,000 times more toxic than glyphosate. They are also endocrine disruptors. They're more toxic than the so-called active ingredient. But all that Monsanto has to do is to say, oh no, just glyphosate's the active ingredient. And then the EPA says, okay, send us your data on just glyphosate. We'll ignore the whole soup, even though Roundup can be 125 times more toxic than glyphosate alone. Next question.
In Seeds of Deception, you talk about biotech's belief in the 1-to-1 ratio between genes to proteins. Can you maybe discuss that a little bit?
Sure. There's been a history of reductionism in science, where in order for us to understand things, we pretend that they're simple. And we create formula or ideas that are entirely wrong. And the history of genetics is like that. Talked to one professor, he said, it used to take one day in a genetics class to explain what a gene is. Now it takes a whole semester. Originally they thought, oh, it's the individual proteins in our bodies that produce our traits. Proteins are produced by genes. So we'll assume that one gene will produce one protein, will produce one trait. So there was the Human Genome Project where they wanted to look at all the different genes. And there was over 100,000 proteins in the human body, and they were looking for over 100,000 genes, and they got like 23,000. So they had, well, what's the matter with that? Well, it means like we have like similar number of genes to, rodents, certain plants. Certain plants have more genes. So it blew their minds. It turns out that one gene can produce many proteins. It can produce a long stretch of RNA, which then can be chopped and reconnected. So it can produce up to dozens or even hundreds of different combinations of RNA, which then produce the amino acid string, which is then folded into a protein. So the entire basis of genetic engineering was based on one gene produces one protein, produces one trait. There's only a handful of traits like that, and they happen to get two right, Roundup Ready and Bt toxin. But it turns out that genes interact with other genes. I mean, the arrogance of this reductionist model is interesting. It used to be that 98% of the DNA was called junk. We didn't know what it was, so we said, oh, just the coding portions, just the genes that code for proteins, that's what's important. But the other 98%, junk genes. Turns out they regulate gene expression. I was talking to Dr. Michael Antonio from King's College in London. He's a human genetic engineer. He does a lot of work in gene research. And he was defending the anti-GMO pro-science movement. Anti-GMO is pro-science. The GMO is junk science. So he was meeting with a bunch of other scientists in this big national debate sponsored by the UK government. And he said, the biotech industry's scientists, plus the UK government scientists, which were all biotech industry scientists, they were so ignorant about basic genes. They said, it doesn't even matter what order you put the genes in. You can split them up and put them in any order, and it's all the same thing, because it's just one gene produces one. They were completely wrong, and the genetic engineering had already been introduced into the food supply. So Dr. Antonio said to me, these guys could have benefited from a basic level in study in genetics. And these are the people defending genetic engineering. So there's a number of assumptions that were used as the basis for safety claims. In my second book, Genetic Roulette, there's a 4-page list of assumptions that turned out to be wrong and what the implications of that are. One was that Bt toxin does not affect mammals. Well, it does affect mammals. In fact, in India, people harvesting the cotton, the Bt cotton, are getting itching and asthma and flu-like symptoms and having to go to the hospital sometimes. Some people that clean the cotton have to take antihistamines every day in order to clean the cotton. People leaning against the cotton bundles can get rashes. When the animals were allowed to graze on the Bt cotton plants after harvest, many died. Sheep, goats, buffalo. I went to one village where all 13 buffalo died after grazing for a single day on the Bt cotton plants. And they had grazed on normal cotton plants for up to 8 years. And in fact, I talked to someone who was involved in the autopsy, and he described the problems with the organs and the messed up digestive tract. Other good news? No. We'll get to the good news in a minute. I don't want to leave you like, thank you, Jeffrey. I'm going to not eat now. We have who has the microphone? Okay.
Thank you. Is it a glyphosate or the Bt that disrupts the gut and makes holes in it? And if I understood you to say that can multiply itself in your gut, how can it ever be eliminated?
All right, I'm going to be very specific. It might be that the corn gene transfers to gut bacteria and then is still functioning. No one studied that. I talked to one of the scientists who did the research that was published in 2004 in Nature Biotechnology that showed part of the Roundup Ready gene transferred to human gut bacteria, but they didn't know whether it was continuing to function. So if it transferred but it's simply dead, then nothing happens. I'll get to the leaky gut in a minute. I was at a lecture, and I think someone from Monsanto stood up in the back and said, if Mr. Smith is trying to tell you that genes transfer to gut bacteria, he's a fearmonger, because we eat green plants all the time, and we're not green. That was their scientific level of understanding. So I said, first of all, you're absolutely right that if you eat plants, they generally don't transfer to gut bacteria. Bacteria pass genes back and forth readily. They're very prolific. They do that. That's how they talk. That's how they gain traits. But the reason they can do it is because the genes are similar, or homologous is the word that they use. The plant genes are very different, and so they don't generally transfer. If they did, the promoter which turns them on won't function in the biology of the bacteria. They're longer than the bacterial genes, and they have other things called introns inside, so the bacteria would have no idea what to do with them. So if genes transferred from plants to gut bacteria, which would be rare, probably nothing would happen. However, the genes that are inserted into the GMOs on the market are largely bacterial genes. So they're homologous to gut bacteria. They're similar. They're not overly long. They don't have introns. And the promoter is artificially put into those that turn them on is from a virus that functions in bacteria. So we have eliminated all the boundaries between genetic transfer and expression, meaning that there is a much higher likelihood that we're walking around with living pesticide factories, with living factories producing genetically modified proteins, and that was all ignored when GMOs were put on the market. So I say it may happen, but we don't know. You asked which one creates leaky gut? Yes. The answer is yes. Bt toxin pokes holes in cells. Now, it pokes holes in cells when it's in high concentrations in a test tube environment. Higher concentrations then are supposed to be found in the corn. But in my article, I explained that it might be that it actually is in higher concentrations than we think in the gut. So it might poke holes in human cells at the concentrations that are relevant. That pokes holes in the cells. The Roundup creates gaps between the cells. There's two types of leaky gut, and it appears that GMOs might promote both. Who has a question? There's a question right over here, right behind you, right behind you.
I want to know if you have a website for people who want to not use chemicals on their lawns. You know, how do we maintain our lawns without using bad things?
Yes, good. RoundupRisks.com. It has a section on alternatives to Roundup. RoundupRisks.com. Who else has a question?
As for the continuing dangers when GMOs manage to go from generation to generation in the changing of proteins?
Inheritable traits. You like to bring up the scary stuff, don't you? How many people have heard of epigenetics? Above genetics. You can have genes, and people may say, oh, it increases your risk of this or increases your risk of that. But unless that gene expresses, you don't know if it's actually affecting your health. What you eat, what you're exposed to, can it change genetic expression? And it's possible that if you expose some food to a mouse, that its offspring will change its genetic expression and its hair color will be different, the coat color. And its offspring will be different. So feeding the pregnant mouse may change gene expression in future generations. The genes are the same, but the genetic expression is different. Double-stranded RNA might change gene expression for more than one generation. When we think about we think about what's in food. It's got vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals. But now we know it has RNA. The RNA from food can affect gene expression, and it may be far more impactful on our health than we ever thought possible. So if we're changing the DNA, we're changing the RNA, and so it could be that we are changing the impact of food, the intelligence of food on our bodies without knowing, with being babes in the woods. Just the early stages of understanding genetics, and yet we're making massive changes. So yes, inheritable changes are possible. We're getting close to the end, so a couple more questions and then I will give you some good news.
Are there any bills that have been recently passed regarding Roundup and GMOs, and are there any open bills now that we can go to our senators about?
Was the last part of the question?
Are there any open bills now that are waiting to be passed that we can go to our senators about?
I don't know of anything in the federal government. There's a hearing tomorrow about the International Agency for Research on Cancer, promoted by Monsanto, trying to get the U.S. government to defund it because they determined that glyphosate was a carcinogen. It's incredible how powerful and how underhanded Monsanto is. You know, the apex organization of the world that declares the carcinogenicity of things, declared glyphosate a carcinogen, and now Monsanto is working to discredit and defund them. They're part of the World Health Organization. There's different states that have different things going, different counties, different cities. We're trying to get the state of California to disallow the spraying of Roundup and other toxic pesticides on schools, child care facilities, and in state-managed parks. They have a thing in school now where in schools they don't allow the spraying of pesticides between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. You know, so it makes sense from a public relations standpoint, but not from a biological standpoint. I don't know of any federal bills. Last question.
I understand that the position for CDC in the United States government is open. And what kind of person would you like to see in that position, the head of the CDC?
Oh yeah, the CDC person who invested in tobacco stocks and pharmacy stock, pharmacological stock. You know, it's interesting. I could just tell you generically that someone told me that he was being up for nomination for the head of the FDA, and he was not allowed through because they were concerned about his position on GMOs. There's a tremendous influence of moneyed interests. I was just talking to Sheldon Krimsky on a Facebook Live promoting the live stream today, and you can ask him this question at the panel, which is at 4 o'clock. But he wrote a paper in a peer-reviewed journal analyzing the conflicts of interest in the National Academy of Sciences committee that reviewed GMOs. They said no conflict of interest. He pointed out that there was 6 committee members that were, as well as the entire National Academy of Sciences, receiving millions of dollars from Monsanto, Dow, and DuPont, even supporting their how to speak correctly about GMOs by Monsanto. So I would have to say that for someone to be in that position, there's often such pressure and such difficulty getting past the moneyed interests. And I don't understand how the process for the CDC would work, so I have to plead innocent on that one. I don't know. All right, so I want to discuss the good news, the tipping point for consumer rejection. One good thing is that when animals are given a choice between GMOs and non-GMOs, they often pick the non-GMOs and avoid the GMOs. And a farmer had learned that this was happening with squirrels, so he bought a bag of GMO corn and non-GMO corn and put it in his workshop and forgot about it, and the mice did the experiment for him. They broke into the bag of non-GMO corn and finished it. They broke into the bag of GMO corn, ate a kernel, and then ran away. This preference has been seen in mice, rats, squirrels, dogs, deer, raccoons, chickens, cows. It's our job to get humans to the level of animals. So what we need to do is we need to share the information. Now, Monsanto's secret documents, I'm not going to go into this piece because it's too long. I was going to talk about the corruption of the EPA, but I think we've got enough corruption information now. Let's just follow I'll bring you to the slide which tells you our URL. Whoops. Oh well, I guess I won't. Responsibletechnology.org. Last slide, please. So, what we have done so far is we've taken the same information that you saw in this room, the change. In the beginning, I asked you to rate yourself from 1 to 100. There you go. From 1 to 100. And there was hardly a very low percentage of you were at the 80 to 100 level. And by the end, the vast majority was 80 to 100. And the vast majority of you were ready to share this information with others. We are now in a situation where the biotech industry wants to genetically engineer nature. All the food, livestock, fish, insects, algae, bacteria, fungus. They want to replace the billions of years of products of the billions of years of evolution with designer organisms. And that's irreversible. You can't clean up the genetic pollution. You can't go pull it out of the gene pool. The only thing that lasts longer than the self-propagating genetic pollution is extinction. But what's happening is the same effect that we saw here today, where people learned the knowledge and decided to change their diet. That's changing the world. What happens is, as people choose the non-GMO, the food companies realize they're losing market share. They rush to become non-GMO to maintain market share. So Nestle's advertises on television that its coffee creamer is non-GMO. Cargill has a badge from a conference, Go Non-GMO. Cargill. We're in a situation now where in hundreds of years, they may look back and say, what saved the genetic integrity of our ecosystem? And it could simply be people choosing non-GMO, forcing companies to become non-GMO, changing the entire evolutionary landscape, or preventing it from being changed, protecting it. And that's what's happening. So we have an ability to protect all living beings and all future generations. No one of us, no human being in the past has ever had the ability to do that. Because no technology was ever deployable that could affect all living beings and all future generations. So the opportunity for us to protect our children and our children's children and all of the beings on the planet is unprecedented. And it's simply a matter of sharing the kind of information you got today. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, you will see some of the ways that we have packaged that information. Seeds of Deception, which you mentioned, is a right brain book. Genetic Roulette is a left brain book. There's a movie called Genetic Roulette. Secret Ingredients will be the most powerful of them all. So please become more than just the choir. Become the singing choir. Become the active choir. Share this information and help us protect the planet. Safe eating. Thank you very much.